welcome to the show, Josh. Thank you so much for joining us this week. Just for our listeners, can you give us a little bit of background on who you are and how you got started in photography?
Yeah, so thank you guys. Pleasure to chat to you. So journey to photography started, I suppose, around 8 years ago. At the time, I was working in a kind of corporate desk job in the city of London. And to be honest, I was probably a little bit bored and uninspired. And I was just kind of going through the motions of, a kind of salary man, as it were.
Hmm.
And I ever since a young age, I've always had more of an affinity and interest in more creative pursuits. Like I really enjoyed like art and design at school, photography, although I failed my photography class at school. And here I was in this job where there wasn't any scope or opportunity to apply myself creatively. And I'd always been a kind of hobby photographer. So kind of, like a weekend photographer when it's sunny and taking pictures of buildings and things around the city, but
Hmm.
never with any like real gusto. And I was looking for a little bit of a new challenge in terms of photography because I was a little bit stale, been doing the same thing for a long time. Didn't feel like I was going anywhere or progressing. And I went down the kind of YouTube rabbit hole of looking at different types of photography. And then I kind of stumbled across street photography. And with the kind of algorithm, you check one thing and then it just feeds you kind of more and more of the same kind of stuff. And
Hmm.
I stumbled on, as we touched on before the show, some videos by Ted Forbes around different types of street photography. And it kind of, um, uh, my kind of, my mind became alive to the opportunity of photographing on the street. So, he was introducing work by people like Ernst Haas, Sol Leiter, Fred Herzog, Gary Winogrand, Joel Morowitz, Diane Arbus. And it really kind of excited me about the opportunity to photograph where you were with what you had, and just kind of capture the time in some way and put your own spin and interpretation on it. So
Hmm.
I gave street photography a go. Obviously, terrible at the start, really terrible. Scared, nervous, didn't really know what I was doing. Probably don't know what I'm doing now anyway. And yeah, I kind of did that when I could for 3 months, and it kind of ignited something in me. And then I thought, okay, so I want to maybe make photography a more important part of my life. Did a bit of soul searching over Christmas and New Year, going into 2017. And then I just decided I'm going to quit my job. So I just left my career behind. I'd been with the same company since graduating. And when visualizing where I wanted to be in 20 years' time, I knew it wasn't sat behind a computer at a desk. Um, you know, I'd seen my dad do it,
Hmm.
and I didn't want to be, in the same position when I was kind of, in my 50s and 60s. So, yeah, I just decided photography was what I wanted to do. And, it was very daunting to go into a new career with no skills, no training, no experience, no contacts, but I
Hmm.
was kind of compelled to try and make it work. And one of my best friends from school that I've known since we were very young, he saw some of the street work that I'd been doing over that 3 months, and he kind of very kindly and generously knew that I was struggling, and said, "Look, could you come and apply the skills that you've learned there? So working with available light, um, you know, changeable conditions, not really much scripted going on, to come and do some stuff for us in that kind of approach." And obviously, I was completely nervous about completely ballsing it up, but he said, "Don't worry about it. You'll do great." And I gave it a go, and they were really happy with the work. And then he referred me to someone else, and I got a few clients in the first year. But I mean, to be honest, I really limped through the first couple of years, and to leave the comfort and security of a nice paid job, to then become your own boss for the first time was very stressful and difficult, and not knowing when the phone's going to ring. But it's not a decision that I regret for one moment.
So it's funny, isn't it? Because I get asked quite a lot of, how do you become a photographer? Or I love photography, I'm thinking about making it my job.
Yeah,
And I literally tell people to do exactly what you've just said. You have to, at some point, just make the jump, right?
yeah,
Because
yep,
if you try and do it half and half, I don't think it's ever going to work. I don't know anyone who has been able to make it work when they're kind of still working in an office or doing their kind of part-time jobs and stuff like that. So no, more credit to you, because that's a horrible jump to have to make. Did you kind of, I assume you probably put a bit of a buffer in the bank from the previous job and just tried to be like, okay, I've got a year here.
yeah, yeah. I luckily when I had a real job, I was sensible. So and then you just adjust your lifestyle to kind of
Mm.
match your means. So
Yeah.
I'm not going out to eat at nice restaurants. I'm not buying expensive clothes. I'm not really traveling that much. All I need is food to pay the mortgage, enough to maybe buy a new lens every now and then, and put some food on the table. So you just adjust your life expenses to kind of match, your income. But yeah, it was definitely a tough challenge. But I mean, I think maybe it's because I'm getting old now. It's the fulfillment of doing something that you really enjoy kind of almost overrides everything else.
Hmm.
And I try and make sure that I prioritize being happy over everything else, and that's kind of hopefully keeps me grounded and motivated and inspired. So it seems to be working out at the moment.
Nice.
I've got two questions with that, Ren, because one, I think, how much was social media important for you starting out? Because at that time, Instagram was been out for a few years, but it was still more focused on photography than it is nowadays, which is more kind of video content. And obviously, you grew a very large following on there. And two, when you say about kind of maintaining your enjoyment of doing what you do, what aspects of it give you the most joy, and are those two connected in any way? Like, do you find that the validation of social media is helpful, a motivator, or is it a distraction, and has that relationship with that changed? So that's three questions, sorry.
You might need to remind me about the three questions, but the relationship with social media has definitely changed. I think
Hmm.
early on, I was probably more insecure about the work that I was doing and kind of was seeking some form of external validation. Whereas now I really look inside myself and ask myself the questions as to, is this the work that I want to make?
Hmm.
So, um, and kind of having a reasonable following on social media is a bit of a double-edged sword because people think it's really, really easy to make a living as a photographer if you have a certain number of followers, and you may get a lot of opportunities put in front of you, but they're normally not very high quality, um, and they uh, how to say they're not the kind of things that are going to go into kind of long-term mutually beneficial relationships with clients, unfortunately. So I mean, most of the stuff has come through my own network over time, with regards to social media. It hasn't really played a big role in it. Where social media is useful is if you want to do, say, print sales,
Hmm.
books, that kind of stuff where you kind of want to have some form of permanence in the work. That's where it's useful. But with regards to client work, not so important in my experience. What was the other question?
Well, I guess whether or not, yeah, you've kind of answered them all. It was to do with the connection with social media, but I guess the middle question was about how you maintain that feeling of joy in the work that you do. And so that kind of leads into like maintaining motivation, because a lot of what you do, or at least when you started out, was spending a lot of time walking the streets and shooting. You'd be walking for hours and hours a day. God knows what your step count was, but probably pretty good.
Yeah.
But I've always struggled personally. I love street photography. It's something that I really have a lot of time and respect for. But I also find it probably the hardest form of photography. And part of that is maintaining your level of motivation to go out when you're thinking, well, I could go out and spend 2 hours shooting because the light's nice, or 3 hours shooting, but I've got to get back to pick up the kids from nursery, or I've got to get that invoice sorted out. I've got to get that, that boring admin task that's part of running your own business done. There's always something else that you can think, well, actually, maybe my time is better spent doing that task than spending 3 hours and potentially getting nothing from it. So your approach is obviously is almost more Zen like. You've found a way to kind of to be disciplined with it, and I'd be interested to hear more about that as well, and how you've developed that and what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, over the last few years, I've really worked on realizing that motivation comes from having motivation comes easily when you put yourself in a good place, both kind of mentally and physically, and that kind of sets the foundation for everything else.
Mm-hmm.
So I really believe that kind of behavior breeds behavior. So, if I haven't taken any good images over the course of a week or a month, and then I end up sitting at home feeling sorry for myself and going down that kind of negative mindset, I find that I will snowball into that kind of place, which isn't a productive one.
Right.
Whereas, I'll get up, I'll do my light therapy every morning. I'll then have my double espresso. I'll then have my super greens and protein shake. I'll then check my emails. And then all of my obligations are kind of done, routine set. And then I have the rest of the day to go and shoot. So, after this, I'll go into the West End. I normally start shooting around 11. I'll then have a break for lunch. I'll shoot in the afternoon, maybe have dinner in Central, and then maybe the early part of the evening, and then I'll come home. And I just try and repeat that process and always put a priority on in terms of shooting, because there's always things happening out there, and life doesn't stop when the light does. So even on a grey flat day like today, there's potentially something that you could see. And in terms of keeping that kind of not getting despondent, the moments that you see that are interesting or lead to good pictures are so rare and fleeting, and it's very easy to get despondent about not making progress towards those images. So what I like to do is just, rather than put myself under pressure to try and create a specific image for a specific project, I like to have a really kind of open view in terms of what I'm going to see. And then kind of when I come home, I can add that to the stacks and different bins in terms of the content, like the weather conditions, the light, the subject matter, the aesthetic. It could be more abstract, it could be more true to life, and then just add to those piles of kind of type over time. So, yesterday I went in, I got an image on the bus that I was really happy with. I took a reflection photo in a shop window that I was happy with, and those go into those two bins. And I have lots of different bins in my archive that we can obviously touch on later. But I'm not putting myself under any pressure to kind of execute on a specific vision, like, say, a documentary project, because I think that would, I would struggle to stay motivated working towards that, because it's very, very hard to find these moments. And I would get frustrated. Whereas, I'm just viewing it like photography is my hobby. I'm just going out for a walk around, get my steps in. Mm-hmm. And if I see something along the way that's interesting, that's just a bonus, that's just the cherry on top.
How do you not kind of go out and feel overwhelmed in terms of, you must have some themes or motifs or ideas that are ticking away? So that's, again, I'm going to give you two questions here. So there's one element, I'm really fascinated by the mindset of how you kind of, I think photographers can go out, and I find if I go out and try and do street photography, I can get distracted. It's very easy to get distracted these days. We're all addicted to our phones and dopamine and stuff, and suddenly you find yourself doing something that's not productive. So that's kind of one aspect of it. And I forgot what the second aspect is. So answer the first one after I remember what my train of thought was.
Yeah, I would say that if you walk in a particular area on a daily basis and you get to know it intimately, the way to describe it is almost like there's this kind of rhythm of that area that is like a song that you know so well. And every now and then there'll be this, sorry, there'll be this note that's out of place in the song,
Right.
this harmony or disharmony,
Mm.
and only you will pick up on that because you know it so well. And this is something that's slightly unusual and slightly different. And those are the things that you're trying to make pictures about.
Yeah.
So for example, on Regent Street last year, there's a perfume store, had a cracked window that was facing the sky. I
Mm.
went in and asked the security guard. I said, "When's the window being replaced?" He said, "2 weeks." So I knew I had 2 weeks to work with this kind of semi-temporary element to try and bring something to life. And I went back every single day until there was a sunset, the conditions were right, the alignment of the traffic. On the final day, they put some kind of plastic to stop it cracking further, to add some more texture to the image. And I enjoy kind of working with these little things that are slightly kind of overlooked, pedestrian, things that probably most people wouldn't even bat an eyelid at, and trying to use those elements and try and kind of work with them to become greater than the sum of their parts. But it's those little kind of overlooked things that are be outside of the everyday, kind of in this unseen world that you're trying to pick up on and trying to make images about. And you walk around, say, the West End. I mean, the streets largely look like the same place day in, day out. But,
Mm.
there's some new construction at Piccadilly Circus, for example. Is there something I can do with that? There's a broken
Yeah.
window. There's obviously people moving within the space. And there's this almost infinite set of possibilities and permutations. And every now and then you'll just get this kind of moment of clarity that there's an image to
Mm.
be made. And it usually doesn't work out, but every now and then it does.
That's amazing. It's a real sense of zen, though, to be able to, lots of people would become blind to everything around them, because they're like, I've seen it all before. I've seen it all before. So it really takes a conscious effort to focus in on the minutiae and start to notice again,
Yeah.
especially these days. I mean, it's fascinating just watching people walk around and with their heads down, buried in their phones, and most pedestrians are so unaware of what's going on around them.
Oh, yeah.
And you're like the antithesis of that. The other question that's come back to me was, where do you find and maintain your inspiration?
So I have I really struggle with dyslexia. So like anything related to words, like I'm just terrible. So I really struggle with like names and text and things like that, just remembering that kind of stuff. But I do have more of a strength in terms of remembering visually things that I've seen. So that
Right.
could be scenes from movies, about the lighting and the kind of mood and feeling of it. It could be paintings that I've seen. It could be other photography, and most of the photography that I consume is actually away from street photography. And you kind of carry these little visual triggers with you, like a painting that you've seen, and then you can kind of bring those visual triggers into your own practice in some way. So, an example: I was walking down Oxford Street early last week, and there was a temporary window display, and it had this fabric with a wind machine that was kind of blowing in the wind, and it had this kind of painted texture on it with people kind of reflected passing behind it. And it reminded me of a painting that I've seen somewhere. I don't know who it was by, but there was a visual trigger there.
Mm.
And I was thinking, well, what can I do to put my own spin, my own interpretation on this scene and this moment?
Mm-hmm.
I know it's going to be gone in a couple of weeks. So, I want to make the most of it and try and turn this into an image in some way. So yeah, it's kind of, I carry these little kind of visual inspirations with me in my mind. And occasionally something will jump out like, okay, so that's the lighting from, a Deakins film or something,
Mm.
or, it reminds me of that scene and stirs up those emotions in you, and you try and bring that to life through a still image.
I do have to ask you, obviously Greg brought this up earlier, the people on their phones, has that made your life easier and harder at the same time? Obviously, people are incredibly unaware of what's going on, but at the same time, you then don't want to create the same shots of people just constantly looking at their phones. So has that limited your opportunities?
Uh, no, I've actually embraced it.
Okay.
So one of the stacks in my Lightroom catalog is actually people's relationships with their phones, and I don't
Oh,
mean just kind of people doing that. I mean almost just the detail of the hand holding the handset. So if you look at the availability of subject matter, recognize it as an opportunity to do
right.
something and maybe say something about this time. The challenge becomes something so boring and everyday and familiar, turning that into a body of work that can maybe say something. But there will come a time when, maybe we don't use phones. There's something else. Maybe back in the day, people were bored of people in fedora hats holding newspapers. I don't know, but times change. So I think it's important to have almost like a sense of the times kind of
Hmm.
running through some of the images as a little kind of to inform about the human condition in some way.
Hmm.
But yeah, I don't mind it. I think where I do mind it is if the scene is just a photo of someone just looking in their phone, because I don't think that really says much.
No, it's not
Um,
hugely exciting, is it? Do you know
but
what?
if there were, yeah,
No, I was just going to say that this whole process that you have absolutely fascinates me, because me and you couldn't be further apart from how we enjoy to shoot.
right,
My enjoyment comes from getting things set up and then having no time to get what I'm shooting, right. And I'm sure you get often get those fleeting moments, but that's not what I'm talking about. You then, with the shop windows, for example, you've got 2 weeks to make that shot. Will you then go back every day for 2 weeks, or will you just over the 2 weeks just try and get something there? Because the patience you must have is far beyond what I can comprehend.
yeah. I just kind of make a mental note, and just on the route, I kind of pass by and try and go different times of day, when it's sunny, when it's dark, and just see how things kind of change and evolve. So,
Hmm.
I do get a lot of images by kind of revisiting spots because the circumstances are not right, or you see something that has the potential for an interesting frame, but the things that are moving past that or happening within that space aren't that interesting. I'm not necessarily just focused on like people and how they sit in a scene.
Right.
I'm quite interested in working with textures and colors and surfaces to kind of almost interpret what's going on, rather than give a kind of a straight kind of documentary photograph
Right.
of something.
And I guess the revisiting the different areas, an area never looks the same twice, right? Because obviously
Yeah,
different time of day, different lighting, different textures, everything will just look completely different, even though it's the same place that you might have visited 100 times.
yeah, and it is easy to kind of limit your beliefs in terms of, oh, I've walked down this street 100 times, but it's all the life within that space that's constantly fluid and changing,
Hmm.
and that is what creates the opportunities. So it's just being kind of open and receptive to that. And I mean, I was walking down Lyle Street in Chinatown the other day, and there was a kind of chrome plaque on a door, and I was thinking, I've walked down here thousands of times and I've never noticed that. And there were kind of faces kind of reflected in it. I was just
Hmm.
like, why have I not noticed that before? So you just get a little bit deeper, a little bit deeper, a little bit deeper, and then you know something will change, like a shop will close down or whatever. But I like photographing in central London because there is that pace of change.
Sure.
It's just constant. And there's the traffic, there's the people, there's just a real blend of dynamic things to work with.
With your liking to know the area and treading it a lot, do you travel much? And when you do travel, do you find it frustrating that if you're only there for a week, you might not be able to get the true sense of the place, or see it in the changing lights that you like to see places in?
Yeah, I haven't traveled much recently. I do enjoy traveling, but I find that in terms of photography, it's very easy to feel quite overwhelmed, particularly
Yep.
when you go to a city. It's kind of like everything's new, everything's different, you don't know it. So if I travel, I like to go somewhere for an extended period, like maybe a month or something, so that you can
Right.
kind of find your feet in the first week, kind of make sense in your own mind about the kind of things that you want to photograph, and then go and kind of make some images once you feel a bit more settled. But yeah, I do struggle and feel a bit overwhelmed in new environments. But as a street photographer, you're kind of, you have to learn to be resourceful wherever you are, and that even extends to applying yourself in commercial work, which normally, if you're applying street photography skills, it's on the street with available light.
Mm-hmm.
There's members of the public to deal with. It's tough, but yeah, I do certainly feel overwhelmed in new environments, but it just takes a bit of time to get settled.
Right.
One thing I wanted to touch on, which you've mentioned, is how you kind of organize your images, because you must be shooting, I don't know how many thousands of images per week, I assume, on days that you are out. I don't know, maybe you're not, maybe you're very limited with what pictures you actually take when you are out, but I imagine you end up with quite a large archive of images coming in. How do you stay on top of organizing that and making sure that things are put in places where they can be found later?
If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have said it's a complete horror show. I was one of those idiots that had things across different hard drives, multiple different Lightroom catalogs. I didn't have a computer that was fast enough to run, a big Lightroom catalog. It was just a complete mess. And the wake up call came when I had 2 hard drives fail. I had about 11 or 12 hard drives, and I had 2 fail.
Don't start Tom on hard drives.
Ooh.
Yeah. And a friend of mine said to me, there's 2 kinds of hard drives, Josh. Those that failed and those that haven't failed yet.
That's
very.
Yeah. I didn't realize you were listening to me murmuring, but yeah, that is exactly right.
Yeah. So I was kind of, I'm not technically minded in terms of computers and things like that. And he was like, look, you've got to go and set up a RAID drive, put your entire archive on there. So at least there's some kind of protection if something goes wrong. So I bought a RAID drive, and now I have my entire archive kind of consolidated onto that. That's then mirrored in the cloud. I use something called Backblaze, which is like unlimited cloud storage with kind of backups. So if you delete something, you can still go back and retrieve it.
Yeah, it has versioning. It's very good.
Versioning, yep. And then I have an offsite network attached storage where I have like the most important files from, say, specific books or files that I want to print, et cetera, et cetera. So that if the worst happens, at least I've got that to fall back on. Now, I'm sure there's a better way to do it, but it kind of works for me.
Actually, that's a really great setup.
Okay.
Like, I feel that it could maybe be tweaked slightly, but if you wanted to make it a bit more complicated and completely fail safe. But actually, as far as I do a lot of consultancy work through Mainframes, that I would recommend that as an initial setup for most people. I think that sounds brilliant. Well done.
Oh, that's good to know. And then I've consolidated all the files in a single Lightroom catalog. And then my kind of big project, kind of away from shooting, is actually just organizing all that data. So I'm only up to the end of 2018 so far. It may take me the rest of this year to go through, but I'm kind of going through every file, and I don't ever delete images. So I pretty much got every photo I've taken. And I
really.
Yep. So
if you're out almost every day, you shoot. I mean, how many files will you shoot on a day? Like,
not that much now. Maybe 30 to 50.
Oh, fine. Okay, cool.
Yeah, it used to be a lot more.
I was going to say, in my head, you're like shooting out like 2,500 frames a day, but okay, that makes sense.
No, that's like kind of urban wildlife photography if you're shooting those kind of numbers. Yeah, I would say at the start I was probably more kind of gung-ho with the shutter button, but now I think you kind of refine. You're a better judge of whether something's worth investing some time in.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have this large Lightroom catalog, and I'm kind of putting things into different bins, like I said before, in terms of the subject matter, the colors, the lighting conditions, the weather, the time of year. And, I'm kind of building up these kind of things that potentially have the possibility to become series over time. But I'm not putting any pressure on any one thing to, say, become my next book. So that's the way I'm doing it at the moment. It's an ongoing process, but the good thing is at least I can see like light at the end of the tunnel now, in terms of getting organized. And I feel like I don't live in that perpetual state of fear of losing my work, because you invest so much time just to get one photo that you're happy with. And then to lose that through silliness of not having it backed up properly is
That'd
pretty
be awful.
devastating.
Yeah,
Oh
I
yeah,
bet.
it's devastating because you can never go back and recreate. You can never say revisit that particular place because the situation's changed.
Yeah.
So yeah,
When you
I
say
take it very seriously.
when you say bins in Lightroom, are you using kind of smart catalogs, or how
Oh,
are
I'm
you
so
actually?
glad you brought this up, because that was literally what I was going to ask as well.
Just like collections.
Right, collections,
So I
yeah.
have like different collections, like day, night. So yeah, I have day, night, seasons, subject matter, people, abstract, true to life, protests, events, all of that kind of stuff. Just so I
Wow.
can kind of even locations. So I have like specific streets. I even have like specific corners as well. So
And so
that.
images might be in multiple collections.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And then over time, I also do like dummy sequences quite a lot. So I go, okay, so these two images that were shot maybe years apart, there's something that feels right about putting these together.
Right.
And maybe they say something together more than they do on their own. And then I print out work prints of images quite regularly, and then I stick them on the wall and see how they sit together. And maybe there's something that kind of has the building blocks of something beyond itself. But yeah, I don't know if that's the best way to do it, but I'm just slowly getting organized so that at least I can go, okay, I want to find a file of this red corner on Wardour
Mm.
Street. I can find that quickly, or I want to find some images made at a protest. I
And
can go and find
you're
that.
doing this with keywords, then smart collections. So
Yes.
that, I mean, I think that's a solid way of doing it.
I'm
Yeah.
sure it won't be long before AI can, when I say not long, I mean, I'm sure there probably already is something that can do this, but literally ingest your entire archive and keyword it for you and start to try and organize images. I mean, it's never going to be perfect, but it could be an amazing resource for somebody with such a large archive like yourself to be able to just get all of this stuff,
Yeah.
keyworded automatically.
And the reason I don't delete images is I think, um, particularly with street photos, with time they can take on a different significance.
100%. Yeah.
And there are images where I've made that I haven't really thought much of at the time, and then maybe looking back, I view them with very fresh eyes and view them very differently. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe they fit with something that maybe I made yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's a lot of dross in there that you need to kind of chop out at some point. But I like to keep those things because even if it's like a little visual reference for an idea, the term we use in street photography is sketches.
Mm.
So it's like rough drafts, sketches of ideas. And then you have your final images that are very separate to that, and those are the ones that you make into work prints, and you put those prints into your archive.
And I have to be a total nerd here, but what system are you using at the moment, camera wise, when you're out on the street? What do you find have you gone through various systems over the years and settled on one that works for you? Because I imagine, well, same in any photography, but really having a system that is incredibly intuitive to you and that you don't think about twice is super important.
Yeah, so I've had the same camera for 5 years. I use a Sony A7R4, I think it is. And it's great. Does everything I need. It's good on the street. It's good for commercial work. In terms of how I use it, aperture priority, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, because I want that creative control over the depth of field. I use the auto ISO, but with the caveat that I do change the kind of minimum shutter speed depending on the conditions. So on a grey overcast day like today, but it's daylight still, I'll have it set to 1/500th to freeze motion. Um, when it's a little bit darker, maybe 1/250th at night, maybe 1/125th. Sometimes I'll go down to a quarter of a second if I deliberately want motion blur into the image, but I can set that. And because I've used it for the last 5 years, I kind of know how the camera will read certain conditions. And then I just use the exposure comp. So if it's sunny, I'm underexposing by a stop always. At night, I underexpose by 0.7. And I find that the files are a kind of consistent baseline of what I would consider an acceptable exposure. I use lenses with aperture rings, so you can kind of see where you are with the aperture on the outside of the camera. I prefer lenses with autofocus and manual focus switches on them, because quite often if something's more static, you want to say set focus to something other than the subject. So I'll lock that in as people are moving through the frame. And it's just a little, I have a little kind of does the job.
I was actually just about to ask, have you blanked out, have you murdered it out? So is it completely blacked out?
Yeah. Because, if you have the word Sony in bright white,
eye-catching.
Yeah, people do look at it.
Of course.
And I have two suites of lenses. So I have little compact primes, like little kind of tiny little compact primes that are kind of like the daily little kind of street camera lenses. So, it's never a chore to carry the camera when it's a really small light setup.
Right.
So generally use either a 50 or a 90. So I'll put one on the camera and then put the other in my pocket. And then I have a suite of G Master lenses as well, 35, 50 and 85. And I'll use those if the work is more low light, more like commercial type work. I obviously use the G Master lenses.
And always primes?
Always.
I'm interested to hear, do you wear a backpack when you're walking, or do you wear a shoulder bag? Because the amount that you are walking, I imagine comfortable shoes, a warm coat, or at least a practical coat where you can drop things in the pocket, and a whatever bag you have are also super important, and probably something that some people might not even consider.
I never use a rucksack unless I'm doing like commercial work where you need to take a backup body, other lenses, air blowers, all of that jazz. But yeah, I generally just have the camera around my neck, so I kind of wear it, and then either put a lens in my pocket or just use like a bag for life or something, like a tote bag, or I have a little crossbody type thin bag and just put a lens in there and some hand sanitizer and I'm good to go. What do I need to carry? I definitely don't need a backpack.
I'm not going to lie, I am so jealous.
Bag for life.
Who
would have thought that was Josh's camera bag of choice?
Yeah, I mean,
bag for life.
a little tip: if you buy, because we have notoriously bad weather in this country, if you go to like Rains or somewhere, they do these little totes that are waterproof, with a waterproof zipper. You can just put a camera bag insert in there, and then you can just put your camera in there, and then it doesn't look like you're carrying a camera. And because you've got the weight of the camera around your neck, it's not a strain on your shoulder.
Have you found then that your appearance and the way that you approach taking pictures is obviously very important on the street? What tips have you kind of developed, or thoughts on the process have you developed along the way in terms of A, kind of building up the confidence to shoot strangers on the street, and B, are there any techniques you use? I remember like Gary Winograd, for example, I've seen videos of him kind of, cranking the shutter and kind of almost like looking at the top of the camera and snapping without people even realizing he's shooting, almost kind of quite frenetic way of working. And then you see other photographers that are very zen. You see somebody like Joel Merowitz, who has just got this enigmatic charm about him, and that if and then somebody like Martin Parr that might take the picture but be looking into the middle distance. So different street photographers seem to develop different techniques and ways of working. What have you found has kind of worked for yourself and in situations?
Yeah, the first thing I'd try and do is not try and obscure or hide what I'm doing, because I think if you act a little bit sneaky or kind of try and conceal your intent, I think that's when people get the wrong impression about what you're doing.
Hmm.
So I try and be open with what I'm doing. Joel Meyerowitz has talked a lot about the importance of not bruising the scene. So, if you go there and kind of people notice someone with a camera with a big rucksack and stuff, everyone's very acutely aware that there's a photographer. Whereas if I'm just kind of walking around with a camera around my neck and then, slowly lifting up and taking a picture and then kind of moving on, no one really bats an eyelid.
You
So
could be a tourist, right?
yeah, you just kind of, you almost become part of the scene, um, almost signal with your body language that you're relaxed and you're not a threat to anyone. And having a kind of a sunny demeanor really goes a long way as well.
That's me
Uh,
out.
yeah, and
You're
not
not meant
kind
to
of
agree. You're not meant to go
yeah.
like, yeah, absolutely. That is you done, Tom. Sorry, not street photography is not for you.
So yeah, having a sunny demeanor and a smile can be very disarming as well. And I think people are very perceptive, and they do notice things. So like if you overstay your welcome, that will make people uncomfortable. So just trying to kind of read the room of the situation, maybe take a couple of pictures, and if circumstances are similar, just kind of do a lap around the block and see how things are changing. But I never really stay in any one particular place for an extended period.
Hmm.
I find that kind of just moving around keeps me engaged and reacting to whatever you see in the moment. And I go over the same areas time and time and time again. So like this afternoon, I may do laps and I was looking at my Google Maps thing the other day. It looks like the kind of route of a madman, just kind of going with no fixed agenda or just completely rudderless in terms of the direction that I'm going. But I know in my own mind that there's certain places I want to pass every day,
Mm.
and maybe I'll do it from a different direction one day. Maybe I'll kind of come from the north rather than the south. And but yeah, I just find it's important just to make people feel relaxed around the presence of a camera, and don't be too shouty that you're a kind of photographer.
Right.
I mean, the complete opposite to that is you become so obvious that people assume that you're kind of working on something, and you're a professional doing something, and then that's when people kind of come up to you and say, "Oh, are you press?" or something like that, which I have had happen before when I had a couple of bodies. But yeah, just relaxed, positive, don't overstay your welcome, be polite to people, stay high if people kind of start looking at you.
Hmm.
Just be a good person, basically.
Have you
Mm.
ever had someone really take kind of proper umbrage and like just really just not want to be, or what you want you not to be there?
I haven't in years.
Well, that's good.
I I have had. Maybe it's because my body language has improved. I'm not sure, or I'm more conscious of what's going on around me spatially. I do try to look around me before kind of taking images just to see kind of what's going on. But Um, I find that the confrontations I've had kind of two minor confrontations before. It was someone getting offended on someone else's behalf.
Oh,
Um, it wasn't actually the subject of the photo, but the most of the images that I make is not just like a straight photo of one person. So there's not really a direct subject to get offended. It may be shooting through something, or you know, if they were looking at me, they'd be going, "Why is this guy photographing a piece of glass from 3 foot away?"
right.
That would be what people were thinking, rather than going, "Oh, why is he photographing that guy walking down the street?" So yeah, maybe I've just matured in terms of my body language, but yeah, I don't really ever have any problems. I can't think of a
But
single.
I guess it also takes you back to your confidence point, right? You know, you've been doing this long enough that you're not kind of, you're not nervous, you're not shaky, you're there with a purpose. This is your job, right? Like this is what you're there to do, and then I think people will sense that and be like, okay, cool, this guy's no threat because he's confident, he's not being dodgy, he's not being kind of sneaky or anything like that.
Mm,
So that's probably
yeah.
why.
Yeah, no, I think also if there should be some kind of compelling reason that you're making the photograph in the first place. So that if someone says like, "Oh, why are you taking a picture of this?" You can kind of explain like, "Okay, I found this really interesting," or the light. So I remember I was photographing something the other day, and there was a guy like, he was like, "What are you taking a picture of?" Not in like a an accusing kind of way, but he was just confused. And I was like, oh, the way the light is coming through this kind of construction hoarding is really interesting. And people were passing through it. He was like, I showed him on the back of the camera. He's like, oh, okay. I didn't even notice. I was like, yeah, that's what I'm taking a picture of.
All
And
right,
he's like,
that's why
okay.
I do my job and you do yours.
Yeah. And he's like, and he looked at me like, okay, you're a weirdo. That's not very interesting. But I found it interesting. And, sometimes even the most pedestrian of subject matter becomes like fascinating. Um, and yeah, I haven't really had any problems.
Who would
Good.
you say your photographic heroes?
Mm,
And you can't
And does
say
it? I
me.
imagine it changes because it does for
yes.
every photographer.
I mean, I think two of my favorite photographers, and not just in terms of their work, but also in terms of their approach, would be Ernst Haas
Hmm.
and Joel Marowitz.
Hmm.
Now, I don't photograph anything like Joel Marowitz.
Mm.
I would say that I'm probably lean towards more of Ernst Haas. But one thing I
Mm.
like about both of them is how they've really explored the medium.
Yeah.
Um, so, Ernst Haas in particular was very experimental in terms of his approach, along with someone like Sol Leiter. He was like a pioneer in terms of color
Yeah.
photography, different focal lengths, different styles. He shot
Slow
movies,
shutter stuff that we wouldn't have
movies,
considered. Yeah.
yeah, movie stills, slow shutters, double exposures. He was very experimental and kind of pushing the boundaries of what is possible
Mm.
within the medium. And I find that really inspiring, rather than just doing kind of one thing one way for an extended period of time. And I think that's one of the reasons why Ernst Haas as a photographer is quite hard to kind of package and say
Mm.
this is his work. But it gives me a lot of ideas when, say, looking at someone like that's work, because he was so experimental, and it makes me kind of question, well, what do we have available to us today in terms of, say, the technology of the cameras and the environment to maybe break some kind of new ground or do something a little bit different to what's been done before. So I find that really interesting. And Joel Meyerowitz, again, you listen to him talking for 10 minutes and it immediately gets you fired up to go and take pictures. His enthusiasm for photography is just like infectious.
Yeah.
And again, he's really explored the medium. So he's known for his 35mm street work in New York, his work from Cape Light, which is one of the most beautiful
Large
books,
format stuff,
large
isn't it?
format.
Yeah.
He's done still lifes, he's done self portraiture. He's such a well rounded and well versed photographer. And that I think that's an experience that he can carry through lots of different subject matter. I find that really interesting and inspiring. So yeah, I'd probably say those two, but there are so many names of
Yeah.
work that you can lean on.
Yeah. It's one of those things I sometimes wish. I mean, London has very good access to um, photography exhibits and stuff, but sometimes not as much as people would imagine for a city like London,
True.
in terms of photography focused museums, for example. But for me, being able to kind of have access to be able to see somebody's work, like like Joel's, or see, I'd love to go see an Ernst Haas exhibition. I don't think I've ever seen any of it as a complete. I've seen images of his in museums and in
Mm.
galleries, but somebody like that would be fascinating to go and see an actual show of. Um, but I think we are coming up to time on this, so I'm going to have to finish with our final two questions. I'm loath to, because you've been a fascinating guest, and I've got so many more questions I'd love to ask you. But one thing we always ask our guests is your desert island camera and your desert island photo book. Now, obviously, we've touched on the camera you use. I don't know if that is going to be your desert island camera. It can be a kind of fantasy camera. And I'm fascinated to hear what your photo book would be, whether or not it's a body of work from one photographer, or whether or not it's something that's kind of more of an anthology or mix of work.
Could I extend the question to a focal length rather than a camera body?
Oh, go on then.
Oh, we've not had this before. All right.
Because I don't, it doesn't particularly excite me in terms of like a camera body. But in terms of a focal length, a fast 50mm lens on any camera would be perfect for me.
Okay.
If there was, say, like a Leica M6, not that I shoot film anymore, but if there was a Leica M6 that had a fixed 50 on there, that would be just perfect. But yeah, a 50mm lens is such a nice blend between kind of intimacy and context, and it just covers you for everything you can do: portraiture, landscape, street, whatever, with a 50mm lens. So if I was on a desert island, that would be, hand me any camera with a 50 and I'd be delighted.
Okay.
Nice.
In terms of the book, I'm probably going to go something that's black and white, something that's not street, and that would be Ravens by Masahisa Fukase, or The Solitude of Ravens.
Yeah.
Now, probably my favorite photography book of all time after Subway by Bruce Davidson. It's very emotive work and probably a little bit heavy, but it's amazing how something with such narrow subject matter can say so much.
It was like shot in a period of grief in his life. Is that right?
Yeah. So the circumstances are that his wife left him, divorced him, and he went a little bit mad, and ended up photographing these ravens. And not only were they the topic of the work, but also it was kind of exploration of his own solitude, being alone suddenly. And just obviously the work is beautiful, but seeing a book that's well sequenced and where images combine to come together to say something greater than themselves, is really, really inspiring. So it's one of those books that like really lives with you. And I think about it a lot. And I think about, the books that I've done and, the power of sequences and, maybe where I could have changed things and what I can do to kind of bring that into my own work moving forward. But yeah, Ravens is probably my favorite book.
Nice.
Excellent. Well, we really appreciate your time coming on the show today. That was an excellent answer. And I think once this goes out, I'm sure we'll have calls to have you back on. So maybe we could revisit this a year down the line or something and
yeah, that would be great.
Touch on some other subjects, because there is so much more I want to talk about. I know that obviously you're somebody who has produced a lot of photography books. You sell prints. You've really kind of proactive in many ways with that. And recently I've heard that you've been shooting on film sets and stuff. So I think that's another avenue that I'd love to come back and explore at some point, because it's definitely interesting to get your perspective on that and see what you've got to say about that maybe 12 months down the line.
Yeah, I'd love to touch on those topics.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, Josh. Really appreciate it. If people want to find you online, where can they find you?
So Josh K. Jack on everything. Just Google it. That'll bring up my Instagram, my website.
And is that where you're most active? Is going to be Instagram? You've not delved into the world of photo or Blue Sky or any of these other things?
No, I'm not a massive social media user anymore. But yeah, just I'll post as and when I feel like it. But yeah, periodically, I'll try and update my website with stuff, and occasionally post on Instagram. I'm more active on Instagram stories.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
Nice.
Okie dokie. Well, thank you very much. We will post show notes below, which will have the things that you've mentioned and obviously your social media handles and everything. So thank you again, and good luck with your future endeavors.
Cheers, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Josh.